Welcome to the Sound Relief Podcast. I'm Dr. Julie Prutsman, audiologist and founder of Sound Relief, Tinnitus, and Hearing Centers. With over 20 years of experience, I've helped thousands find relief from tinnitus and hearing challenges. On this podcast, I'll break down the latest research, share expert insights, and offer real solutions to help you take control of your hearing health. If you're looking for answers, hope, and a path to relief, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello. Today, I'm excited to have Dr. Tony Kovacs here with us. He's our audiologist in Fort Collins at our Sound Relief, Tinnitus, and Hearing Center there. And Dr. Kovacs brings a wealth of knowledge and information to his patients and just to anyone who's interested in finding out more about music and tinnitus and hearing loss, how all of these things relate. Dr. Kovacs spent several years as a touring musician back in his youth, and so he has just a wealth of experience that he can help share with us today to make sense of some of the complex topics that we talk about and get a lot of questions about from our patients every day. So, Tony, let's start off with just your background. Can you tell me a little bit more about your musical background, how you got started in music, and then what led you to audiology, kind of that whole path?
Yeah. Well, I think that as far as starting with music, well, first of all, I'm a vocalist mostly. I can play some instruments, but not well enough that I would perform them on stage. So mostly I'm a vocalist. And, just getting together with other guys in high school and starting bands. And it's just always kind of been something that I was interested in. And it's pretty easy to find a group of friends that were also interested in that. And who knew we'd all be lifers when it comes to that. We started getting fairly professional with it, as we got into our 20s and even early 30s. We were touring quite a bit. We did some international touring, put out records, did the whole thing.
Were you a sound engineer before getting into audiology? Where did I remember that coming from?
Yeah. So while I was a touring musician, I went to Columbia College, Chicago for audio arts and acoustics. I thought I wanted to be a sound engineer because I liked spending so much time in the studio with my band. It turns out that I really like doing things mostly for my own band. I was never, I never worked in a recording studio. I didn't go and pursue that. I wanted to be a touring musician. That was the thing. And so I utilized a lot of what I learned, and I got my degree, utilized a lot of what I learned as an audio engineer, and but took it on the road and became a touring musician. I went back to school actually for and I don't know that we should even get into this, but I actually went back for speech language pathology. Is that just too windy of a road there?
No, because I think a lot of people do that, right? And then talking about why you switched over to audiology is kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
So cover that. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So I'm curious then. So where did speech pathology enter the picture for you? How did speech pathology enter the picture for you?
Yeah. At some point with being a professional musician, especially this is in the mid 2000s when it was pretty tough to be a professional musician. No longer were bands making money on record sales because everything was starting to stream. Gas prices starting to get absolutely astronomical. And it's tough being a touring musician. Musicians are kind of finicky. And so you have a group of them in a van touring year after year. It's a hard life to maintain. So I wanted to do something different. And really, I just wanted to help people communicate. That was my thing. I don't want to dictate what they're communicating. I just want to help people who can't communicate. And so that led me into speech language pathology. And I didn't even know what an audiologist was when I went into speech language pathology. But as it turns out, as an aspiring speech language pathologist, you have to learn about the other side of communication instead of just speech. You also have to learn about hearing. It's two sides of the same communication coin. And because of my background in audio arts and acoustics, it just came so much easier to me. It just clicked. It was easy. And so it was an easy transition to say, oh, this is what I should have been doing all along. Why have I, And so that's what kind of led me into audiology. One of the things that led me into audiology.
Yeah. And communication, it's so interesting, right? Because speech and hearing sciences fall under kind of that communication disorders umbrella. And it's always so interesting to talk to audiologists on how did you find this field? And so many of them say, well, I started off thinking I wanted to be a speech pathologist with kids. And then, it took a different direction, just like you, because, communication does take both having the ability to articulate, but also the ability to hear well. So that totally makes sense. And I could see how, those classes would be a little bit more spot on for you because you already had that background in acoustics. And so that would be a lot easier.
Right. But the speech side of things, I think also really came in handy being a vocalist. And there was a lot of crossover there where, spending a lot of time in a recording studio, being very careful about the articulation and how to present certain phrases of singing and being in key and all of that really, there's just a lot of crossover there with the speech part of my training and education. And so it really kind of came together in a very well-rounded way for me. Yeah.
That's awesome. And really, I know I've heard other people say this and I totally agree with it. I mean, a lot of musicians will say my most important instrument is my hearing, my ear.
Yeah.
Right. Because if you don't have a good frequency resolution or ability to tell, pitch and intensity, all of these things, I think it would be a lot harder to be in that field as a whole. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Tell me more about, as a vocalist, what advice you would give to other vocalists that are thinking, I want to sing, but I don't want to damage my hearing. I don't want to cause symptoms like tinnitus or ringing in the ears long term. So how do you handle that as a vocalist? I mean, I'm sure you could relate to when you started off, what advice do you wish somebody would have told you when you were starting off versus what you know today even?
Yeah, I really went into, well, first of all, hearing protection, is super important, but equally important is finding someone who knows a bit about musicians' hearing protection, because I kind of, just went in blindly. I'm like, I know I need to protect my hearing, but I didn't really have the education behind it. And so, on tour, not every single night did you have a pair of hearing protection. Usually I would use like the foam plugs, but sometimes if I didn't have that, I got very good at making makeshift earplugs out of like toilet paper or something. I like folded it just the right way. And so, I think that probably the best advice is to seek out a musician specific audiologist. I even did get hearing protection at one point from an audiologist who was fine, but didn't really know anything about musicians' audiology and musicians' issues in particular. And that's okay, but I really wish I had found someone who knew a bit more about that, because I just said, I'm worried about my hearing. I just want the best, the strongest protection. And sure enough, he said, okay. And he fit me with 25 dB attenuation filters, which, we'll probably get into it, but that's too much for what I needed. So going to someone who can really give you more detail about what's going to work for your particular situation, for your instrument, for your workload, how often are you playing, that all makes a difference.
So what I hear you saying is that hearing protection is absolutely possible for vocalists and musicians in general. It's just that you have to have the right type, the right information, the right guidance.
Yes.
To know if what you're using is appropriate. And if someone is out there listening that has tried hearing protection and it didn't work, what would you have that same advice that, hey, maybe you just didn't go to someone who knew what to properly recommend? What do you think is typical there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of reasons that a musician might think that this isn't going to work for me. And I feel like I've come across just about all of them, but working with other musicians who, even just people that I've played with in bands that are like, oh yeah, I tried it. It didn't work out for me. I'm like, oh, okay, we got to have this conversation. Definitely there's much more guidance that can be had out there to show you what might work for you. Some of the things that come up for people is they'll say, oh, I can't hear my instrument well. Okay, well, maybe you have a little bit too high attenuation of a filter on there. Or, I don't know. What are some of the other some of the other complaints. I can't get them in all the way, just silly things like that. I don't know how to put them in properly, or they just fall out of my ears, or, they don't work. And there's so many simple corrections that can be made there. When it comes to vocalists are probably one of the harder musicians to fit, because it's tough when you're singing. You get that occlusion effect. You can hear yourself loud in your head, which sort of covers up all the other instruments. So that can be a little bit challenging. For those folks, it might be a conversation to get into in-ear monitors, maybe. But of course, that's a kind of a next level thing for a lot of musicians to start going the in-ear monitor path.
Yeah. So when you see, this is kind of maybe a silly question, but I've always wondered this, and you're here, so I'm going to ask you. When you see vocalists with in-the-ear monitors and they're on stage and they're kind of taking one out or taking it partially out and then putting it back in, what exactly is going on that they have to, be messing with it on stage while they're singing?
Yeah, great question. So with in-ear monitors, you get a mix, the exact mix that you want of all of the instruments filtered or streamed directly into your ear. It's really a wonderful thing. The problem with that is that you're blocking out sound around you, and musicians talk to each other now and then. They need to communicate with one another on stage. And so a lot of times they'll take one out to say, hey, what's the next song? What are we going to play now? And so they'll take one out, and they get sick of taking in it and out. So they just leave one out, and you've completely, now you're not getting any hearing protection on that side. That can be a bad situation. So there are a lot of solutions to that companies have come up with, in-ear monitor companies in specific.
So when it comes to all the different options of hearing protection, I think there's some confusion out there because you have that NRR, that noise reduction rating on packaging. And I don't think people really necessarily understand, if it says you have a 22 NRR, they automatically think, oh, that should be good enough. But can you talk a little bit about the difference between like just wearing foam earplugs with an NRR rating, a lower NRR rating versus something with a higher rating, and what that exactly means and how people should really look at that information?
Yeah. So NRR means noise reduction rating, and it's a basic guide on how much attenuation or how much you're turning the sound down as far as what's actually making its way to your eardrum. We have a little joke in audiology where we call it not really relevant is the acronym, because when they come up with those NRR ratings, there might be like 6 scientists putting a plug in your ear in just the perfect spot and really getting it just right. And that's just not, there's so much room for user error. And I can't count how many times I've been in a situation where someone's wearing hearing protection and they're just barely sitting in there. And I guarantee they're not getting an NRR of 22 or whatever it might be. So yeah, the foam plugs, they're effective if you are putting them in correctly. And putting them in correctly means rolling them incredibly tight, maybe even lifting up your ear so that you can get it far enough down into the ear canal and letting it expand, and doing the little tug test at the end to make sure it's very secure in there. Very few people are actually taking all of those steps to make sure that they're protecting themselves. There are some, especially for musicians, there are some downsides to foam plugs, of course. Foam plugs, you're listening through this piece of foam in your ear, and the way that sound works, lower pitches, lower frequencies have longer waves, right? It's just a longer wavelength. And so it can make it through that foam plug much easier than the higher pitches or higher frequencies, which have a much shorter waveform. This is actually the same principle. This is why when your neighbor is having a party next door, you can hear the bass, but not the treble. It's because those low frequencies can make it their way right through those walls, whereas the high pitches can't. And that's the same thing that's happening with foam plugs. So even if you are getting them in correctly, as a musician, it might not be the best option for you, especially if you need to hear the detail in your instrument.
Compared to just a foam earplug. I know some people have heard of the musicians' filtered earplugs with different filter levels. What's the difference there between a, off-the-shelf foam earplug for $2 versus custom filtered earplugs? When would you recommend those for people?
again, when someone needs to hear the intricacies of their instruments, especially stringed instruments, if you're wearing foam earplugs and you're trying to hear the detail of the higher strings on your guitar, you're just not going to hear it, especially if you already have a little bit of damage to your hearing. Then you're really not going to notice. But with a filtered earplug, the filter has what we call flat attenuation, meaning the bass, mids, and treble all come down evenly instead of the bass making it through really well and only the treble coming down. It's almost like turning the volume down on your environment. And there'll be different ratings as far as how much attenuation that you're getting with those plugs. So for example, a popular scale might be a 9 dB attenuation filter, a 15 dB attenuation filter, and a 25 dB attenuation filter. And those are appropriate for different situations. Generally speaking, the more, maybe the longer you're playing or the louder it is, you might want a more attenuation, a better protection.
So you bring up another great point that I think a lot of people are confused about is how we like to talk to patients about how sound is dose dependent, right? Mm-hmm. So, and there's different, I think, thoughts out there, like at what level should I be considering hearing protection in general? And again, the reason we're talking about this is to protect your hearing is to help avoid tinnitus, right? So right. That's why we're talking about this in such detail is people really want to know, how do I avoid that 24/7 ringing in my ears or head that I've experienced before leaving a concert without hearing protection, for instance. So with the different attenuation levels, you mentioned to start that as a vocalist, 25 dB of attenuation would probably be too much. So were you more comfortable with like the 9 or the 16, or did you have to experiment? Is everyone's voice a little bit different in terms of what they'll feel better with?
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the first audiologist that I went to and said, I want to try musicians plugs. I said, just give me the most, I don't want to damage myself. So he fit me with 25 dB attenuation filters. And I thought that was fine, but it really was probably overkill for a couple reasons. One, you just don't need that much attenuation, or at least I didn't need that much attenuation for how often and how long we were playing for. So when you say dose dependent, mm-hmm. You're saying, okay, well, the longer, it's just like being out in the sun. If you're out in the sun for 5 minutes, well, you'll be okay. But if you're going to be out there for 5 hours, you might want to have a heavier protection on. You might want to do SPF 50 instead of 30 or something like that. And the same thing is true with noise exposure. It's not only how loud it is, but how long you're exposed for. And there are some general guidelines on that. So in my case, 25s it was just too much, because now I'm not hearing as much as I would like to hear on stage. And you run into the risk of overprotecting. And that's a whole different area that we can get into, but there are dangers, not dangers per se, but there are risks in overprotecting your hearing. So you don't want to do that either. There's a sweet spot. And if you know how loud things are and how long you can be exposed for, then you can choose the right hearing protection. This is another reason why it's really important to see an audiologist who knows about these things and who can guide you through that for the best protection.
Mm-hmm. I can't imagine, and I know this is happening, but I can't imagine anyone having all that wealth of information themselves to be able to go online and order directly from an online source without, these kinds of discussions and guidance from an audiologist. So that makes a lot of sense. But to your point, asking your audiologist, do you have some background working with musicians? I mean, not everyone's going to be like you and have that, great background of being a touring musician themselves. But if they have experience fitting musicians, you think they're more likely to find success with all of this?
You would think, you would think that, it really is a niche within audiology. There are musician specific audiologists out there. Not as many as we would like to see. Most audiologists out there are really primarily focused on hearing loss and not even tinnitus, And so musicians audiologists, you're going even deeper. So it can be challenging to find someone who knows a bit about that niche, but it's worth your time to look into it and see if there's someone in your area who knows about that. I would say in most major cities, there's probably an audiologist somewhere out there that knows how to work with musicians specifically.
And so tell me a little bit more about the difference between in-the-ear monitors versus just like a stage monitor, and what the differences are there, why someone would choose in-the-ear monitors over some other type of monitoring system.
Yeah. So in the ear monitors are really, really nice as opposed to like a wedge monitor on the stage. So a wedge monitor on the stage, you ask the sound guy, okay, I want more bass, I want less drums, I want, more of myself, less of that guy, whatever. That's all coming out of the monitor in front of you. But of course, it's just a monitor that's just blasting everyone, right? Whereas an in-ear monitor, each person on the stage, if everyone has their own in-ear monitors, then they can get exactly what they want in their ears, because the bass player might want something totally different than the guitarist versus the singer versus whatever other instruments you have up there. One of the big challenges for that is that a lot of folks think that with in-ear monitors that in and of itself is hearing protection, that they're protecting their hearing. But that's not true. There was actually a study where they had many musicians set up their instrument in front of a stage monitor and get it to the levels that they like it. And we like it loud on stage, especially if it's an aggressive form. If it's rock and roll, it's supposed to be loud. And so you want it to be loud. And so they would turn it up to where they like it. And then they would give them an in-ear monitor or a set of in-ear monitors. And they would say, okay, let's set it exactly where you like it. And it was within 2 dB, very, very close. And so the moral there is that whether you have a wedge monitor or whether you have in-ear monitors, you have to actively turn it down. It's not just a hearing protection in and of itself, but if, and again, it's almost like hearing protection. If you go to someone who knows a bit about hearing conservation and musicians' audiology in specific, you're going to get better education on how to safely use your in-ear monitor so you're not causing these problems like tinnitus, right?
Right. So I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question. So we know for patients that have hearing loss, right? They have many people with hearing loss have a reduced dynamic range. So it takes more sound to get them to hear soft sounds, and they have reduced tolerance for loud sounds. We think because of the underlying damage to their system. So they have this reduced dynamic range. How does that relate to what we're talking about for musicians? So if they have this reduced dynamic range because of potentially hearing loss and maybe even tinnitus, what does that look like? What problems could that cause for a musician?
Yeah, that's one of the many problems that can happen. I think that musicians and a lot of people in general, it just happens to have a specific importance to musicians because you really need your ears for more than what the average person needs it for. But there are many, many things that can happen in addition to what most people think of just, oh, well, hearing loss equals the volume is lower. And yeah, that's true. That's one of the things that can happen with hearing loss, but there's a whole slew of things, including what you're talking about, reduced dynamic range. So if this is the lowest you can hear and this is the highest you can tolerate, if you have damage to those cochlear hair cells, well, the lowest you can hear comes up, as you said, but the highest you can tolerate comes down. So now, here's the world, but here's your world. This is your new dynamic range. And of course, that can cause issues it can cause issues for anyone. But if you are subjecting yourself to a loud environment night in or day in and day out, that can absolutely cause some issues in terms of comfort, in terms of being able to find your vocal range if you're a vocalist. I mean, it can really cause a lot of issues.
And what about frequency resolution and ability to tell pitch differences, these types of things? Is that typically impacted?
Yeah, so that's related, but that's another issue that we can add. So we have loss of volume, right? Your classic, what people think of when they think of hearing loss. We have tinnitus, and now you have reduced dynamic range on the bottom and the top, right? And also, and maybe even before all of that stuff starts happening, the very first thing can be this reduced frequency resolution. So this is something, you could go to a regular audiologist and say, gosh, something's just not right. I don't know what it is, but something's not right. I really want to get my hearing checked out. And this is what happened to me, actually, where I went to an audiologist. He tested my hearing. He said, you're fine. There's no issue. So, I don't know. Things sound off. I'm not hearing quite as well as I did in background noise. I can tell that people around me are able to make out what's being said better than I can in a restaurant per se. What do you mean my hearing's fine? Like getting angry about it. And no, looks fine to me. Well, what happens before it starts showing up on a classic hearing test, you get something that's called hidden hearing loss. And what it means is you're starting to do some preliminary damage to those hair cells that it's not enough damage to show up on a hearing test, but it's enough to start making things, it's to start distorting things slightly. And so with that reduced frequency resolution, and this is something that I suffer from, where maybe someone with perfect hearing, you can tell the difference between 1000 hertz and 1002 hertz, right? Very, very small difference in pitch there. And most people with normal hearing can hear that slight difference. However, if you have some of this preliminary damage going on and those hair cells are starting to be affected, it might now, instead of 1000 to 1002 hertz, it takes you all the way from 1000 to 1006 hertz to be able to tell the difference. Now, for most folks, that's not going to matter too much, but for a musician, it might make a world of difference. And I discovered this firsthand, being in the recording studio, and I'm doing I'm singing, and I think I am just in perfect pitch, right? And the producer's going, "You're flat, man." And I'm like, "No, I'm not. I'm not flat. I'm singing that perfectly." It's like, "No, you're flat." I'm like, "No, I'm not." And the next thing you know, I'm arguing with the guy, and he's like, comes over and he pulls out an auto tuner and shows me, this is what it would sound like if you were singing in key. And I could hear that slight difference when he actually put the auto tuner on. I was like, "Oh my God, I'm flat," and it was just like mind blowing to me. So these kind of things can happen for musicians that wouldn't affect the normal, non-musicians. So there's all kinds of issues. It's not just a volume drop. Like I said, tinnitus, volume drop, this hidden hearing loss, this frequency resolution gets messed up, and you're not able to hear as well as far as the key that you're supposed to be in. And then of course that reduced dynamic range, and issues that can come up with too.
Let's talk about hyperacusis, because we know about 25% of people with tinnitus can also present with hyperacusis or hypersensitivity to sound, kind of this recruitment to sudden changes in loudness levels where they feel actually a pain response, almost a physical response to loudness where they used to not. And then that's got to be really hard. It's hard for everyone, but especially hard if you're in the music industry because things get loud. And they can get loud quickly, right? So talk about what your experience has been with hyperacusis and musicians in general.
Adding to our list of issues that can come up with musicians is hyperacusis. And going back to that dynamic range, if there's damage to those hair cells, yes, you can't hear as low as you used to, but also the top comes down a little bit. And what happens is, or at least what happened for me, because I did suffer from hyperacusis, and I was actually able to correct that just through studying and working with it and learning about hyperacusis. But what it is a decreased sound sensitivity to sounds that other people might perceive as not loud, or if it is loud, it's not painful. But if you have that top come down a little bit, then suddenly your threshold for where pain starts is lower than most people's, and certainly lower than where you'd like it to be. And so now in my case, I found myself in this situation where, my wife would turn on the blender and I'm going, "Ow, how could you?" And I'm like running out of the room like yeah. and what happens is part of it is due to the damage to those hair cells, but part of it is psychological, where you now know that you have done some damage to your hearing and you don't want to do any more damage, especially if your livelihood depends on it, like a professional musician or a recording engineer or people who work with music. And so because you don't want it to get worse, your threshold for pain comes down. And so now you're experiencing truly a pain effect when there shouldn't be one. And in the most extreme cases, this is another one of the dangers of overprotecting. If I'm using 25 dB attenuation filters everywhere I go, my threshold for what sounds loud is going to slowly come down. And you don't want that to happen. In the most extreme cases with hyperacusis, there are folks who can't go to a grocery store without wearing some hearing protection because just average sound seems so loud to them. So that's an extreme case, of course, but we don't want to inch in that direction, especially as a musician.
Yeah. So I think people often come into the clinic confused by this concept with hyperacusis, right? They think, how could you be telling me that protecting my hearing is bad? Right. So how do you counsel patients that are wearing we've all seen them, if you deal with tinnitus and hyperacusis with patients, we've all seen them come into the clinic and they're wearing earplugs or earmuffs, even to sit in our lobby. They can't drive in the car without earplugs or earmuffs. And they think they're doing themselves, a service in a way, because they're saying, hey, I'm protecting myself. I'm being active here and preventing more hearing loss. But why is that? Can you go into it a little bit deeper of why is that not the case? Why is overprotection bad?
Yeah. So overprotection creates this situation where your brain goes into protection mode earlier. I'm trying to think of a good analogy here. I really am trying to think of a good analogy.
Yeah. The fight or flight. Yeah, you're trying to think of the fight or flight as it relates to.
Yeah.
For sound like this. I'm trying to think of one that I would use.
So most folks, if they're using hearing protection, they're at least aware that they should be using hearing protection, right? And they should be using hearing protection because they're exposing themselves to hazardous levels of sound. But without the education of where that level of what we call hazardous starts, you're just guessing, right? And you might be wrong. But your brain just says, well, that sounds loud, it must be hazardous. And that's not necessarily true. So again, what happens is you start overprotecting, and now when your threshold is low, now sounds that really aren't dangerous suddenly are dangerous, or your brain thinks that they are, even though they're not. And so again, now you're going to have a much harder time working in noisy environments if you're thinking that you're harming yourself when you're not. So it's really important to understand what is safe and what is not, because if you don't know the difference, then you could be overprotecting yourself and really impeding your ability to do your job. Yeah.
And your quality of life could be impacted too, right? Because I know, we have patients that come in and say, I can't leave my house practically just because they're fearful of their environment. So how do you treat that? Is that something that could be changed, reversed?
Yes. A lot of it comes down to counseling. There are things that we can do to help folks undo that, what their brain is locked into this place where they're experiencing pain when they really shouldn't be. And so there's some counseling involved. There's some things that we can do physically with sound to help them, and utilizing sound therapy in various ways. The good news here is that there is a slew of research about how loud things have to be in order to hurt you, and how long you can be exposed in order for them to hurt you. And so the formula here is, it's logarithmic. So for example, if you can be exposed to 85 dB of sound for up to 8 hours a day, and it's not going to hurt you. You have 8 hours of dosage per day before it's potentially harmful. But every time you take it down 3 dB, you have to cut the time, or I'm sorry, every time you bump it up 3 dB, you have to cut the time in half because it's logarithmic. So 88 dB, now suddenly you only have 4 hours. 91 dB, now suddenly you only have 2 hours. But so you learn about these scales, and I talk about this with patients all the time, and I'll give them a physical scale. So you need 3 elements in order to know whether or not you're protecting yourself adequately. One, you need to know this information. How loud can it be before it's hurting me, and how long can I be exposed for? Once you have that information, that's the big first step. You also need to know how loud it is in the environment. So you might need a sound level meter, right? And there are ones you can put on your phone that are pretty close. I help people with this as well. And then the third thing, of course, is you need proper attenuation filters or proper hearing protection. So if you have those three elements, you know exactly how long you can be exposed before you're potentially damaging yourself in any environment. And so, yeah, a lot of it is education. And when it comes to hyperacusis and people who say, oh my gosh, this sound is hurting me. Well, wait a minute. We have this information that shows that there's no way this is hurting you. You could be in, maybe they're at like 80 dB and they're saying, oh my gosh, this is really going to hurt. You say, but it's not actually causing any damage. Look, you could be in this environment for 8 hours a day, every day for the rest of your life, and you will not do one lick of damage to your auditory system. And so you start kind of backing people off the ledge a little bit, sort of dipping their toe in the water, or maybe the reverse of that, but it works. Sometimes you give people permission by showing them that they're not truly hurting themselves, and it changes their mind about things. And now they can mow the lawn and not panic about it, that kind of thing.
And have you found success in helping patients through kind of a desensitization process when they have hyperacusis? Do you think you can desensitize someone gradually if they're scared of saying, hey, I can't imagine not going, to the grocery store without my earplugs in. How am I going to get through this? I can't just talk myself out of it. What do you find helpful there?
Yeah. So in some cases, we can use hearing protection that we can back off the attenuation slowly. It doesn't have to be abrupt. Hey, you're okay. Don't worry about it. It's not just ripping the Band-Aid off. We can do hearing protection to various degrees. Like I said, going from a heavier hearing protection to slowly backing that off so that the patient feels safe. We can utilize sound therapy, because with sound therapy, if you have this sort of competing sound going on in the background, which we might use sound therapy devices, the whole idea is to calm down the limbic system. The limbic system, of course, is the circuitry in your brain that categorizes things as problematic or safe. And so we really want to retrain the brain to not categorize these sounds as problematic. And sometimes that does take more than just counseling, or oftentimes it takes more than counseling, this desensitization process with sound therapy, different types of hearing protection. There's ways that we can back people out of this. Yeah.
That's great. And then have you also seen patients with hyperacusis and tinnitus? What does that look like?
Yeah. I would say that's pretty common, because both of those are symptoms of damage to the auditory system, right? So you can have all of these things that we're talking about can all be happening at the same time. Decreased volume, decreased clarity, tinnitus, hyperacusis, all of that can be happening at the exact same time. Luckily, with tinnitus retraining therapy in particular, which is what we practice, it's the same systems in your brain that have a negative reaction to the tinnitus as have a negative reaction to sounds that are perceived as too loudly. And so we can utilize some of those same tactics to back you out of that and make the tinnitus much less bothersome, and tell your brain it's okay to, these sounds aren't as dangerous as your brain is making it out to be. It's all about retraining that limbic system. And that we really do use sound therapy is a huge key part of that. And of course, the educational counseling and sharpening your skills and all of that. There's quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense that you would have to kind of attack it from several different angles when you have all of those symptoms that you just described occurring at the same time. I'm sure it can seem overwhelming to some people when they have all of these things going on at the same time. But what advice would you give someone if they're just starting to notice, say, tinnitus and reduced sound tolerance, but they really haven't been checked out yet? What would you recommend?
Well, first things first, go get it checked out. Go get some education on it. It might be a case where we just need to nip this in the bud. You might not need a full treatment plan or something like that. We would want to find out how much it's having an impact on your quality of life, and if we can stop it where it is and just do a gentle backing off of it, or if we need to be a little bit more aggressive in our treatment. But the first things first is just go see someone who knows about these things and get it checked out.
Yeah. So if you haven't had a comprehensive hearing evaluation and maybe even a tinnitus workup, that's what you're saying is the first step, is to really just have this all checked out and rule some things out, right?
Absolutely. On a hearing test, and even if we do need to do, earlier we referenced that there are hearing tests for hidden hearing loss, where we can do testing that doesn't show up on a traditional hearing test. But oftentimes with tinnitus, with hyperacusis, with even, some of the frequency resolution stuff, we can see a lot of that on our hearing tests. Oftentimes tinnitus will line up very closely to where there is damage in the auditory system, which gives us an idea of how we're going to treat that. Or maybe if we need to treat that. There are people who come into my clinic and say, yeah, I'm noticing a little something. I just want to get it checked out. And okay, this is what's going on. This is what your hearing's doing. This is where your tinnitus is now. Maybe it's not time to treat yet, but let's monitor this. Why don't you come back next year? We'll check it out and make sure that everything's okay.
Yeah. See if everything's stable year to year. It's pretty hard to predict, isn't it? Whether someone's system is going to be stable or not. Talk a little bit more about because I think a lot of people can relate more so these days, I think, than ever, to this concept of hidden hearing loss. And because we see, like you said, in our clinics, patients coming in saying, I can't hear a lick when I go to dinner with my wife at this noisy restaurant. She swears to me that I have hearing loss and I'm just getting tired of it. So if it's not showing up on a traditional hearing test, what's the other testing that they should have done to find out maybe what's going on? Tell me about that additional testing that a lot of people haven't heard of before.
Yeah. So maybe an important place to start here is just a tiny bit about what's going on with hearing loss. In the inner ear, you have what's called the cochlea, and which is the spiral organ that has 3 rows of hair cells. And there's thousands of these hair cells in these 3 little rows. It's a good thing that we have 3 rows, because if some damage happens to those hair cells, you might still be able to do just fine on a normal hearing test, because you're not wiping out the hair cells. It's just a little spottier, even though you can hear okay. But in that background noise, if you have kind of spotty hair cells inside the cochlea, you might not have the accuracy and the precision that those hair cells offer in terms of that frequency resolution, really being able to pinpoint sounds. You can hear sounds, but maybe the clarity is just a little bit compromised there. On a traditional hearing test, as you said, you won't even know that there is that hidden hearing loss. But the test that we do is called Otoacoustic emissions. And what that means, oto, ear, acoustic, sound, and emissions, as it turns out, those hair cells aren't just passive. When sound comes into your ear, yes, those hair cells bend along with that sound, but the hair cells actually move in and of themselves. So they actually emit a sound as well. And so with this very sensitive testing, we can find out the integrity of those hair cells. I'm going to say that line again. We can find out the integrity of those hair cells very, very precisely. And we'll be able to see, are all of the hair cells in a particular range working like they should, or are some of them starting to break off, but not quite enough to show up on a traditional hearing test? And so that actually is that very thing happened to me when I was in school for audiology. As an undergrad, when we started testing our hearing, I said, this can't be. I mean, I can't hear in restaurants very well. How is this hearing test saying that I'm hearing just fine? But then we did this otoacoustic emission testing, maybe a little bit further down the line once we got into more specialized testing in my training, and my otoacoustic emissions don't look so good. I said, oh, that's it. Okay. I have some damage, enough to mess up my clarity, but not enough to mess up my volume yet. And that can be really detrimental to musicians, especially if they go to an audiologist who says, your hearing's fine. So, well, what the hell?
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is otoacoustic emissions is a specialized test that can detect damage before it'll show up on a conventional hearing exam. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Great. And so would we run, or would you say that most audiologists run otoacoustic emissions as part of a standard hearing test?
No, typically not. Yeah, no, typically not. I mean, even in my clinic, if there's a hearing loss, I might not use otoacoustic emissions because I don't need to. I don't need to do, I don't need to find out if you're going to have hearing loss. I just found out you have hearing loss. So why do the otoacoustic emissions? It's just giving me more information about what I already know. But if someone comes in and says, I'm just not hearing well, and I do the regular test, I say, let's dig a little bit deeper. And that would be an appropriate time, at least in my experience, to use those otoacoustic emissions. And people appreciate it. I liked it, when I find, finally somebody gave me an answer of what the heck's going on here, because the last audiologist I went to said everything was fine. So.
Right. And then it's always interesting because I don't know that I've seen any research on this, but maybe you can chime in here too. I hate when I hear from patients that a doctor's told them their hearing is normal for their age, right? And you're going, what does that even mean? That is not relevant. That is not accurate. But I can totally relate to this too, because I have tinnitus in my left ear. My otoacoustic emissions are reduced in my left ear, even though my audiogram is normal. So when someone comes into you and says, hey, my doctor said my hearing's normal for my age, what does that say to you? Or what do you start thinking when someone presents with that information, and where do you go from there?
Yeah. While it's true that the older we get, the more likely that it is that we might have stuff wrong. The longer you live, the more likely it is you're going to mess something up, but there's not a strong correlation between age and hearing damage. There's some, but it was a very, very minor player when it comes to reasons that you could have damage to your hearing. So what that tells me is that whoever checked him out, didn't really know where to go from there, and just said, well, you're older. Hey, it happens. And that's pretty much the end of it. I have patients in their 20s who have really damaged their hearing pretty significantly. And I have patients in their 80s whose hearing is much better than those people in their 20s, so there's really not a strong correlation there. We lose, I believe, 0.5% of hair cells per year after about the age 30. So yeah, there is some of that, but ears are like skin, in the sense that two people can go out into the sun and one person will burn in 5 minutes. The other person can be out there all day and not have a problem. It has nothing to do with age. It's just your genetic makeup. So there's a little bit of truth there, but not much. Not enough that we would base anything on it, really.
Right. Exactly. Tell me a little bit more about, you mentioned tinnitus retraining therapy and how you use that for your tinnitus patients. What other strategies that come alongside with tinnitus retraining therapy do you find to be particularly helpful for your tinnitus patients? Is there anything, you talked about sound therapy. Is there anything else that you find to be particularly helpful for your patients with tinnitus?
Yeah. So, tinnitus retraining therapy at its core is all about retraining how your brain interacts with the tinnitus, right? There is no cure per se for tinnitus, but even for people who are suffering immensely with tinnitus, we can get that tinnitus to be much, much less bothersome, way less impactful, and not have nearly as much of an impact on their quality of life. It can be so much less. And there are different ways that people respond when you're trying to get their brain to interact differently with the tinnitus. Part of it might be just a lot of education. The more you understand how your brain interacts with the tinnitus, and it's a fairly complex situation happening there. There's a lot of parts of your brain that are interacting with the tinnitus in different ways. And the more you shed light on that, the easier it is for you to back off. So some of it is going to be educational counseling and building patients' skills in terms of what to do when they're having a particularly bad tinnitus day. One of the approaches that resonates with me, and therefore I present to my patients, is using mindfulness. Mindfulness is, which is sort of like a hot issue in our culture right now, but it's been around for just thousands of years. But mindfulness is simply non-judgmentally observing what's happening. And most people will equate mindfulness with meditation. In that case, what you're doing is you're sitting and breathing, and you're just observing how your body just breathes on its own. You don't even have to do it. It's just doing it on its own. And so you're just truly, stopping thinking as much as possible. And there are ways to, of course, accomplish that. But your goal is to just be still and just watch what's happening. And so I start with education of all the parts of the brain that are involved in tinnitus. And then I encourage mindfulness strategies to just get patients to just watch this process happening, non-judgmentally. So even if you are experiencing stress or anger or any of these negative emotions, that's okay. Let that happen. But tap into the part of your brain that's truly just observational. You're just watching what's going on. And it's a practice, but what you're trying to do is get people out of that limbic brain, out of that fight or flight sort of sensation, and just to watch it, because you can't be the observer and the sufferer at the same time. You can learn to cross over into just the observational role. And that's where mindfulness has really been beneficial.
So you're saying if people can understand better what's going on in their system and how their brain is reacting, that understanding could lead to some relief.
Absolutely. And mindfulness is just one of the ways, we do in our practice, we use cognitive behavioral therapy, which there's just a number of different approaches that you can take to get folks to not be so heavily involved with that limbic part of their brain, so that tinnitus can calm down and get in the background. There are a number of strategies. Mindfulness is just one of the ones that I feel resonates the most with me when I'm trying to calm down. So.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're working with patients with these strategies, what do you find is a good predictor of a patient's success with tinnitus treatment? Is there any one thing that you say, gosh, if all my patients could come to me with this one thing, I would say you are for sure going to experience tinnitus reduction?
Yeah. Luckily, most patients who are sitting in front of me have the right mindset. And that's truly what it comes down to. If you're open to trying things that are maybe a little bit out of your comfort zone, mindfulness, we're talking about meditation. This isn't the type of thing that, just everyone has tried or knows much about. But if you're open to trying things, that's going to make a huge difference. If you're not open to trying things, I do have patients who unfortunately they'll come in and they have their arms crossed and they have this kind of, fix me sort of mentality. And what do you mean there's no cure? And just this sort of standoffish kind of mindset. And that's very difficult to work with. Not saying it can't be done, but you do have to get them to open up to thinking about this in different ways. But mindset and determination to succeed, very important. And if they have those things, they'll be fine. We can absolutely get your tinnitus much, much less bothersome.
Yeah, great. So having that growth mindset, being open-minded is what I hear you're saying is a good predictor of success, and trying not to stay in that fixed, skeptical mindset, because it's going to be a lot harder to induce changes in the brain. We know, right? We've seen it, not only in audiology, but in a lot of other areas of healthcare as well. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. You've covered so much with us today here, Tony. Dr. Kovacs, we're so glad you were here. Any final thoughts, anything that you think, I wish people knew, or anything that you'd say? If there's one thing people take away from our discussion today, what would that one thing be?
Hearing is important, more important than you might realize. We haven't even touched on, yes, we've covered how important that can be for musicians. But we haven't touched on the cognitive piece to this. It's so important. Your eyes and your ears really are the windows to the world. And if those windows are foggy, then it can have some impact on your cognitive ability. And there's a huge body of research showing increased risk for cognitive decline with hearing loss. So even if it's just a little bit of, I have a little bit of trouble in background noise in restaurants or something like that. Even you don't have all of these, I'm not a musician. I don't need my ears in order to make a living. It's still really important. It can help you live a longer, healthier life. I would say just for about just anyone. I'm saying that all crazy.
That's okay.
I would say for just about anyone out there, it's important to get your hearing checked now and then. I get people who come in and they're, 60, 70, 80 years old. They've never had their hearing checked. And it's like, oh, there's so much benefit to it. So just treat your ears with respect.
That's a great segue. Yes, to hearing matters, protect your hearing, go get it checked out if you haven't had a baseline hearing test, just so we know where you stand. And if you are a music lover, you're a musician, go to someone who knows something about this area so you can get the right advice, the right options to protect your hearing and still enjoy the quality of life that we keep mentioning, because music is a great part of everyone's life. So let's enjoy it, but let's do it safely, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Kovacs. I know we're going to have you on again to talk even more about these areas, but we appreciate all your time today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
One more thing. This podcast is presented for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice from your physician. Thank you.